The coffee shop inside Fort Braxton's main headquarters buzzed with the usual morning chatter of officers grabbing their caffeine before briefings. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat alone at a corner table, her laptop open, fingers dancing across the keyboard as she compiled training schedules and equipment requisitions. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, but something about her screamed, "Paper pusher," to everyone who walked by. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Major Thompson from 3rd Battalion stopped at her table, glancing at her screen filled with spreadsheets. "Still shuffling numbers, Mitchell?" he asked with a condescending smile. "It must be nice having such a comfortable assignment." Sarah looked up briefly, her green eyes calm but sharp. "Someone has to keep track of where your ammunition goes, sir." Her voice was steady, professional. But there was something underneath it that made Thompson pause for just a moment before walking away with his buddies, their laughter echoing across the busy cafe. What none of them noticed was the way Sarah's left hand unconsciously adjusted her watch band, covering something small and metallic underneath. What they couldn't see would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman they'd dismissed as just another desk jockey. Sarah Mitchell had been assigned to the administrative wing of Fort Braxton for exactly 18 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, not that she was counting. Her days began at 0530 with a 5-mile run around the base perimeter, a habit that earned her strange looks from the other administrative staff who considered a brisk walk to the parking lot sufficient exercise. She'd shower in the empty locker room, dress in her perfectly pressed ACUs, and arrive at her desk by 0700, 30 minutes before anyone else in her department. Her workspace was immaculate. 3 monitors displayed various databases, tracking systems, and communication networks. A small American flag stood beside her keyboard, and a single framed photo of mountains, somewhere in Afghanistan, sat next to her coffee cup. The photo was turned slightly inward, just enough that casual observers couldn't make out the details, but Sarah could see it clearly from her chair. The morning Thompson made his comment about her comfortable assignment, Sarah had already processed 47 equipment requests, updated training rosters for 6 different units, and coordinated transportation for an upcoming joint exercise with the Marines. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, each keystroke purposeful and efficient. Captain Bradley Foster, the administrative department head, walked by her cubicle carrying a stack of files. "Mitchell, I need these training schedules distributed to all company commanders by 1,200 hours, he said, dropping the papers on her desk without slowing down. "And make sure you cross-reference them with the equipment availability reports from last week." Sarah nodded without looking up from her screen. "Already done, sir. The files are in your email, sorted by priority and cross-referenced with both equipment availability and personnel readiness scores." Foster stopped mid-stride, turned back. "You finished the cross-reference? I just assigned that an hour ago." "I anticipated the requirement when I saw the training request patterns yesterday," Sarah replied, still typing. The correlations were obvious once you mapped them against resource allocation timelines. Foster stared at her for a moment, something flickering in his expression between impressed and suspicious. "Right. Good work, Mitchell." He walked away, shaking his head. The truth was, Sarah saw patterns everywhere. In the requisition requests that revealed which units were preparing for deployment, in the medical supply orders that indicated training intensity levels, in the personnel transfer requests that showed where the command expected to need experienced soldiers. She could read the entire base's operational tempo just by watching the data flow across her screens. But nobody asked her about patterns. Nobody asked her about operational tempo. They saw her desk, her computer, her spreadsheets, and they saw exactly what they expected to see. A competent administrator who'd found her niche in the safe, predictable world of military bureaucracy. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez from the motor pool stopped by Sarah's desk around 1030 hours, carrying a tablet with a frustrated expression. "Mitchell, I've got a logistical nightmare here. Command wants me to move 60 vehicles from 3 different motor pools to support a training exercise next week. But the transportation requests don't match the fuel allocation reports, and half the vehicles are scheduled for maintenance." Sarah glanced up from her screen, took the tablet, and scrolled through the data for exactly 37 seconds. A convoy from Motorpool Alpha needs to depart at 0400 to reach the training area by 0630. Motorpool Bravo vehicles should stage at Checkpoint Charlie overnight to avoid conflicting with the fuel truck schedule. Motorpool Delta vehicles can be substituted with the reserves from the 82 ND's Motorpool if you coordinate with Sergeant Williams before 1500 today. Gonzalez stared at her. How did you? I've been trying to figure this out for 2 hours. Sarah handed back the tablet. The fuel allocation report from 3 weeks ago shows delivery schedule patterns. The maintenance schedules follow a predictable rotation based on vehicle usage data. Cross-reference those with the exercise requirements and the solution becomes apparent. You memorized fuel delivery schedules from 3 weeks ago? Sarah was already looking back at her computer. I remember what's relevant. As Gonzalez walked away shaking her head, Sarah's left hand moved to her watch again, fingers tracing the edge of the band where it covered a small piece of metal. The movement was unconscious, habitual, like touching a lucky charm or checking for something important. The administrative wing of Fort Braxton was a different world from the rest of the base. While infantry soldiers conducted training exercises and special operations units disappeared for weeks at a time, the admin staff maintained the steady rhythm of military bureaucracy. Purchase orders, personnel files, training schedules, equipment maintenance logs. The unglamorous foundation that kept everything else running. Most of the soldiers assigned to administrative duties were there for specific reasons. Some were recovering from injuries. Others had specialized skills in logistics or communications. A few were marking time until retirement, comfortable in positions that kept them away from the physical demands of combat units. Sarah Mitchell fit none of these categories, which made her something of an anomaly. Her personnel file showed a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Georgia Tech, followed by Officer Candidate School and immediate assignment to Fort Braxton's administrative division. No combat experience listed. No specialized training beyond basic logistics management. No obvious reason why a sharp, physically fit young officer would be content pushing papers. Colonel James Hartford, the base operations commander, had reviewed her file several times over the past 18 months. Something about Mitchell's assignment didn't add up, but he couldn't put his finger on what bothered him. Her performance evaluations were flawless. Her supervisors praised her efficiency and attention to detail. Her security clearance was current and had never been questioned. But Hartford had spent 28 years in the Army, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. There was something about Lieutenant Mitchell that didn't fit the profile of a career administrator. The way she carried herself, the way her eyes tracked movement around the headquarters building, the way she seemed to absorb information from every conversation happening within 50 feet of her desk. At 1,147 hours that morning, Hartford walked through the administrative wing on his way to a briefing with the base commander. As he passed Sarah's workstation, he noticed her posture, the precise way her hands moved across the keyboard, the way her head tilted slightly when she listened to radio chatter from the communications desk across the room. He paused, pretending to review a document while observing her peripheral vision. Sarah's fingers never stopped typing, but Hartford could tell she was aware of his presence, tracking his movement without obviously watching him. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said suddenly. Sarah looked up immediately, her green eyes meeting him with calm attention. "Yes, sir?" "How long have you been assigned to administrative duties?" 18 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, sir." The precision of her answer confirmed Hartford's suspicion that this wasn't a casual assignment for her. "And before that?" "Officer Candidate School, sir, followed by advanced logistics training at Fort Lee." Hartford nodded, but something in her tone suggested there might be more to the story. "You seem to have adapted well to the administrative environment." "I go where I'm needed, sir." As Hartford walked away, he found himself thinking about Lieutenant Mitchell's answer. "I go where I'm needed." Not, "I enjoy administrative work," or "I requested this assignment." Something told him there was a significant difference between those responses, even if he couldn't yet figure out what it meant. The first real confrontation came during the Tuesday morning briefing in Conference Room B. Sarah sat in the back row, laptop open, taking notes as various department heads presented their weekly reports. She wasn't supposed to be there. Administrative staff typically received briefing summaries through email, but Captain Foster had asked her to attend to track resource allocation discussions in real time. Major Kevin Walsh from the Intelligence Division was presenting threat assessments for upcoming training exercises when he paused mid-sentence, looking directly at Sarah. "I'm sorry, but why do we have clerical staff in a classified briefing?" The room fell silent. Sarah continued typing, her expression unchanged, but Colonel Hartford noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Captain Foster cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Mitchell is here to coordinate logistical support based on operational requirements discussed in the briefing." Walsh's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Right. Because understanding enemy movement patterns and terrain analysis is really going to help with ordering office supplies." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Several officers chuckled. Sarah closed her laptop with a quiet click and stood. "I'll wait outside, sir," she said to Foster, her voice professionally neutral. "Actually, Lieutenant," Colonel Hartford interrupted, "stay. Your logistical insights might be valuable." He turned to Walsh with a look that could freeze water. "Continue your briefing, Major." But the damage was done. As Sarah sat back down, she caught whispered comments from nearby officers. Probably taking notes for her typing pool. Wonder what strings she pulled to get into classified briefings. Bet she's someone's niece. What they didn't see was how Sarah's pen moved across her notepad, not just recording Walsh's threat assessment, but mapping the tactical implications of enemy positions against terrain features, calculating supply line vulnerabilities, and identifying 3 critical gaps in the intelligence report that could cost lives if overlooked. Her mathematical mind processed the data faster than the intelligence analysts could present it. After the briefing, Sarah packed her materials and headed for the door. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Stone from the Psychological Operations Unit blocked her path, arms crossed, and smiled predatorily. "Mitchell, right? I've been curious about you." Stone's voice carried the kind of fake sweetness that preceded verbal warfare. "You've been here over a year, but nobody seems to know your story. Where did you serve before this cushy assignment?" Sarah met her gaze steadily. "I've been exactly where the Army needed me to be, ma'am." "That's not really an answer, is it?" Stone's smile widened. "I mean, most officers have some kind of background. Combat experience, specialized training, leadership positions. But you just appeared in admin one day like you materialized out of thin air." Other officers had stopped to listen, sensing drama. Sarah felt their attention like heat on her skin, but her voice remained calm. "My personnel file is available through proper channels if you have questions about my qualifications." Stone laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I've seen your file. Georgia Tech math degree, OCS, advanced logistics training. Very impressive for someone who's never left American soil." She leaned closer. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what's the most dangerous thing you've ever faced? A particularly challenging spreadsheet?" The officers within earshot erupted in laughter. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her watch, fingers finding the covered metal beneath the band. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Not anger, but a kind of distant recognition, like someone remembering a half-forgotten dream. "The most dangerous thing I've faced," Sarah said quietly, "was learning to trust people who hadn't earned it." The laughter died. Stone's smile faltered as she tried to parse whether she'd just been insulted or given a philosophical observation. Sarah walked away, leaving them to figure it out. The harassment escalated over the following days. Someone taped a sign to Sarah's desk reading "Office Warrior" with a cartoon drawing of a soldier fighting a paper dragon. She removed it without comment and continued working. Her coffee cup mysteriously went missing from the break room, replaced by a child's sippy cup with "desk duty" written in permanent marker. She used it for 3 days before someone finally threw it away out of embarrassment. Lieutenant Brad Stevens from the Military Police Unit seemed to take particular pleasure in undermining Sarah during staff meetings. When she presented logistical recommendations, he'd interrupt with questions designed to make her look incompetent. "Mitchell, you're suggesting we restructure the ammunition distribution timeline, but have you considered the tactical implications of delayed resupply during active operations?" Sarah would respond with detailed analysis of supply chain vulnerabilities, alternative distribution methods, and contingency planning that demonstrated a deeper understanding of tactical operations than Stevens possessed. But he'd wave her off with comments like, "That's all theoretical, of course. Real operations are different from what you read in manuals." The pattern continued for weeks. Stevens would set traps. Sarah would demonstrate expertise that should have been impossible for someone with her official background, and Stevens would dismiss her knowledge as book learning, while the other officers nodded agreement. During one particularly heated exchange about vehicle maintenance schedules for a joint exercise with Marine units, Stevens pushed too far. "Look, Mitchell, I appreciate that you can read maintenance manuals, but coordinating with Marine logistics requires understanding how different units operate in the field. You can't just plug numbers into a computer and expect it to work in real combat situations." Sarah set down her pen and looked at Stevens with a kind of patience usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to children. The Marines use a different maintenance philosophy than the Army. Their equipment cycles are based on operational tempo rather than calendar schedules. They prioritize mission-critical systems over comfort equipment, and their supply chains are designed for rapid deployment rather than sustained operations. Their mechanics are cross-trained on multiple vehicle types because they operate with smaller logistics footprints. Stevens blinked. "Well, yes, but the exercise you're planning assumes Army logistics protocols, which means the Marines will be waiting for parts that don't exist in our supply system, while we'll be providing maintenance support for equipment configurations we've never seen." Sarah pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop, rotating it so Stevens could see. "I've identified 37 compatibility issues that will result in operational delays, equipment failures, or safety violations if not addressed." The room was quiet. Stevens stared at the screen, his face reddening as he realized he was looking at analysis that would have taken his entire logistics team weeks to complete. Captain Foster leaned forward. "Mitchell, how do you know Marine maintenance protocols?" Sarah closed the laptop. "I read their technical manuals, sir. They're publicly available through military databases." "You read Marine technical manuals in your spare time?" "I read what's relevant to mission success." Stevens recovered his composure, but his voice had an edge of desperation. "Reading manuals isn't the same as field experience. Anyone can memorize procedures, but until you've been in a situation where lives depend on your decisions, it's just academic theory." Sarah's hand moved to her watch again, that unconscious gesture that none of them had learned to recognize as significant. When she looked up, something had changed in her expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of focused intensity that made several officers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "You're right, Lieutenant Stevens," she said quietly. "Reading manuals isn't the same as field experience." The way she said it made Stevens pause, as if he'd just stepped on something that might bite back. But before he could respond, Captain Foster called the meeting to an end, and the moment passed. Later that afternoon, Sarah was working alone in the administrative wing when Sergeant First Class Diana Rodriguez from the Communications Center stopped by her desk. Rodriguez was different from the others, older, more seasoned, with the kind of quiet competence that came from years of real responsibility. "Mitchell, can I ask you something?" Sarah looked up from her computer screen. "Of course, Sergeant." "That analysis you did of the Marine logistics protocols, where did you really learn that?" Sarah's fingers paused over her keyboard. "I told you. Technical manuals." Rodriguez pulled up a chair, lowering her voice. "I've been in communications for 15 years. I've worked with Marine units, Army units, Special Forces, Air Force, Navy. I know what it sounds like when someone's repeating book knowledge, and I know what it sounds like when someone's talking from experience." She leaned forward. "That wasn't book knowledge." Sarah saved her work and turned to face Rodriguez fully. "What are you suggesting, Sergeant?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing that there's more to Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell than what's in the official records." Rodriguez's voice was careful, respectful. "And I'm wondering if maybe someone made a mistake putting you behind a desk when you could be doing more important work." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying Rodriguez's face. Finally, she spoke. "Sometimes people are exactly where they need to be, even if it doesn't look that way from the outside." "And sometimes," Rodriguez replied, "people are exactly where someone else thinks they should be, whether it makes sense or not." After Rodriguez left, Sarah sat alone in the empty administrative wing, the only sound the quiet hum of computers and air conditioning. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number with no name attached, just a series of digits she'd memorized, but never called. Her thumb hovered over the call button for almost a minute before she put the phone away and returned to her spreadsheets. Outside, Fort Braxton continued its daily rhythm of training exercises, briefings, and military routine. Soldiers who'd never questioned the quiet lieutenant in administrative housing continued their preparations for deployments, exercises, and missions that would test their skills and courage. None of them knew that the woman they dismissed as a paper pusher had been watching their training schedules, their equipment requests, their personnel transfers, and their operational patterns with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what those patterns meant and where they led. And none of them suspected that beneath the watch band on Sarah Mitchell's left wrist, a small piece of metal caught the fluorescent light whenever she moved her hand. A metal tab with insignia that would have changed every conversation, every assumption, and every dismissive comment they'd made over the past 18 months. But Sarah wasn't ready for those conversations yet. She had work to finish, patterns to analyze, and a role to play that was more important than anyone realized. The mockery would continue, the underestimation would persist, and Sarah Mitchell would keep filing reports, coordinating logistics, and maintaining the careful fiction that she was exactly what she appeared to be. Until the moment when that fiction would become impossible to maintain. The emergency alarm shattered the quiet routine of Fort Braxton at 1,347 hours on a Thursday afternoon. Sarah was reviewing transportation manifests when the base-wide announcement crackled through the speakers. Code Black. All personnel implement lockdown procedures. This is not a drill. Code Black meant active shooter on base. Sarah's training kicked in before her conscious mind processed the words. She was moving toward the emergency supply closet when Captain Foster burst through the administrative wing doors, his face pale with panic. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted to the scattered clerical staff. "Lock the doors, turn off the lights, and get away from the windows." The administrative building erupted in controlled chaos. Civilian contractors dove under desks. Junior enlisted personnel fumbled with cell phones trying to call family. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Clark from Human Resources was hyperventilating near the copy machine. Sarah moved through the confusion with purposeful calm, checking door locks, closing blinds, and guiding panicked personnel to secure positions. Her movements were economical, efficient, like someone who'd done this before under much worse circumstances. "Mitchell, help me move this filing cabinet," Foster called out, struggling to barricade the main entrance. Sarah assessed the cabinet's weight, the door's swing pattern, and the sightlines from outside in less than 3 seconds. "That won't work, sir. The cabinet's too light, and you're blocking our emergency exit route. Better to use the conference table on its side, angled to deflect rather than stop." Foster stared at her. "How do you know?" "Foster." Colonel Hartford's voice cut through the commotion as he entered through the rear entrance, flanked by 2 military police officers. "What's the status here?" "All administrative personnel accounted for, sir. The building is secured." Hartford's eyes found Sarah, who was positioned near the emergency radio, monitoring communications traffic. "Mitchell, what are you hearing?" Sarah had the radio's earpiece in one hand, a notepad in the other, sketching what looked like a tactical map. 2 shooters confirmed. 1 neutralized near the commissary. The second suspect was last seen moving toward the family housing area, approximately 4 minutes ago. MPs have established a perimeter, but there's a gap in coverage between buildings 12 and 15. The MP's sergeant beside Hartford frowned. "How do you know about the perimeter gap?" Sarah handed him her notepad. The sketch showed the base layout with remarkable accuracy, including patrol routes, checkpoint positions, and the logical movement patterns of someone trying to avoid capture. Radio chatter from Units 3, 7, and 12 cross-referenced their positions with the suspect's last known location and probable escape routes. The sergeant studied the map, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. This is better than our tactical display back at headquarters." Before anyone could respond, a new voice crackled through the radio. "Command, this is Patrol 6. We've lost contact with the Family Housing Patrol. Repeat, no response from Unit 9. The room went silent. Unit 9 was responsible for protecting the base housing where soldiers' families lived. If the shooter had reached that area. Hartford grabbed his radio. "Command, this is Colonel Hartford. What's the status of family housing evacuation?" "Static." "Then." "Sir, evacuation is incomplete. Approximately 30 families are still in lockdown in their quarters. We've lost radio contact with the patrol unit assigned to that sector." Sarah was already moving toward the emergency equipment locker, her movements sharp and decisive. She pulled out a tactical vest, checked its fit, and started loading equipment pouches with practiced efficiency. "Mitchell, what are you doing?" Foster demanded. Sarah didn't answer. She was studying a detailed base map on the wall, her finger tracing routes between their current position and the family housing area. "Colonel, how many MPs do you have available for immediate deployment to family housing?" Hartford's radio crackled again before he could answer. "All units. We have multiple reports of shots fired in the family housing area. All available personnel respond immediately." Sarah turned from the map, and for the first time since anyone had known her, her carefully maintained facade cracked. The quiet administrator was gone, replaced by someone else entirely. Someone with the kind of focused intensity that came from making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Sir, with respect, your MPs are approaching this like a law enforcement situation. But if the shooter's in family housing, this is a hostage rescue scenario. Different rules, different tactics." Hartford stared at her. "How do you know?" "Because I can hear it in the radio chatter. Your people are setting up containment perimeters, but they're not moving to neutralize the threat. Every minute they spend establishing positions is another minute that the shooter has to find targets." The radio erupted with frantic voices. "Shots fired! Building 18! We need medical support! Command, I can see movement in the windows! Where's our backup?" Sarah was checking the tactical vest's equipment pouches, her hands moving with muscle memory that had nothing to do with administrative training. "Colonel, you need someone in there who understands close-quarters combat in a residential environment. Your MPs are good soldiers, but they're not trained for room-to-room fighting with civilian hostages." "And you are?" The question came from Lieutenant Stevens, who'd arrived with a group of officers drawn by the commotion. Sarah's green eyes met him with an expression that made him step backward. "Yes." The single word carried weight that silenced the room. Not "I think so" or "I've read about it." Just "yes," delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from experience. Colonel Hartford studied Sarah's face, seeing something there he'd suspected but never confirmed. "Mitchell, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that I go in and get those families out while your MPs maintain the perimeter." Sarah's voice was steady, professional, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "I can move through residential terrain without triggering a hostage situation. I can identify and neutralize threats while minimizing civilian casualties." "You're talking about a combat mission," Hartford said slowly. "I'm talking about saving lives." Stevens recovered his voice, though it shook slightly. "This is insane. She's an administrative officer. She's never seen combat. You can't seriously be considering." Sarah's hand moved to her watch, but this time, instead of the unconscious gesture they'd seen before, she deliberately unfastened the band and let it fall to the floor. The small metal tab that had been hidden beneath it caught the fluorescent light. Everyone in the room could see it clearly now. A Ranger tab, worn smooth from years of wear, attached to a thin chain around her wrist like a bracelet. The silence stretched for exactly 7 seconds. "Holy shit," someone whispered. Colonel Hartford's voice was quiet, but carrying absolute authority. "Everyone out except Mitchell. Now." The room emptied quickly, officers and enlisted personnel filing out with stunned expressions. Sarah stood alone with Hartford, the Ranger tab visible on her wrist, her posture unchanged but somehow more solid, more present. "How long?" Hartford asked. 8 years active duty, 4 deployments. 2 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment before," she paused, "before I was reassigned to administrative duties." "What happened?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the room's walls. Kandahar Province, 2019. Joint operation with Special Forces. Intelligence failure led to an ambush. 12 Americans KIA, including my entire squad. Her voice was steady, clinical. "I was the only survivor." Hartford waited. "After an action review concluded that I made tactical decisions that prevented additional casualties, but..." Sarah shrugged. "Command decided I needed time away from active operations. Administrative assignment was supposed to be temporary, give me time to process what happened. 18 months ago. 18 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. The radio crackled again. "Command, we're taking heavy fire from Building 18. Suspect appears to have multiple weapons. We need immediate support." Hartford looked at Sarah, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not the quiet administrator, not the competent logistics coordinator, but the combat veteran who'd been hiding in plain sight. "The families in that building," he said, "are going to die if someone doesn't do something different than what your MPs are trained for." Sarah picked up her watch from the floor, fastening it back around her wrist, but leaving the Ranger tab visible. "I've been exactly where the Army needed me to be for 18 months. But right now, the Army needs me somewhere else." Hartford considered for exactly 5 seconds, weighing regulations against reality, policy against the sound of gunfire coming through the radio. "What do you need?" Sarah was already moving toward the door. "A vehicle, direct communication with your perimeter teams, and 5 minutes to get into position before your people move." "Mitchell." Hartford's voice stopped her at the door. "If you do this, there's no going back to administrative duties. Too many people will have seen what you're capable of." Sarah's hand rested on the door handle. "Good." As she left the administrative building, Sarah Mitchell, logistics coordinator, spreadsheet expert, quiet desk officer, ceased to exist. In her place was Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, 75th Ranger Regiment, moving with the controlled urgency of someone returning to work she'd never really left. The mockery, the dismissive comments, the assumptions about her capabilities, all of it fell away like a discarded disguise. The officers who'd spent months undermining her authority were about to learn what 18 months of administrative duty had been hiding. But first, she had families to save and a shooter to stop. Everything else could wait. The transformation was complete, and Fort Braxton would never see Sarah Mitchell the same way again. Sarah moved across Fort Braxton with the fluid precision of someone navigating familiar terrain. The military police had established a perimeter around the family housing complex, but their positions were defensive, designed to contain rather than resolve. She could see the tactical flaw immediately. They were treating this like a barricaded suspect situation instead of an active threat to civilians. The Humvee Colonel Hartford had provided was parked behind Building 14, giving her a clear view of the crisis zone. Building 18 stood 3 stories tall, red brick with white trim, identical to dozens of other family housing units except for the broken windows on the 2nd floor where muzzle flashes had been reported. Sarah keyed her radio, using the command frequency Hartford had authorized. "Overwatch to command, I'm in position." "Command to Overwatch, you have 5 minutes before we resume standard containment procedures." 5 minutes. Sarah had cleared entire buildings in less time, but never with unknown civilian positions and a suspect whose capabilities remained unclear. She pulled out a pair of binoculars and began systematic observation of the target building. 2nd floor, eastern windows, blast pattern on the glass suggested outward fire, confirming the shooter's position. 3rd floor, lights still on in multiple units, indicating families were still inside and maintaining normal routines, unaware of the threat below them. 1st floor, front entrance was clearly visible to MP positions, but the building had rear emergency exits that weren't covered. Sarah's mind automatically calculated fields of fire, approach routes, and civilian evacuation paths. The MPs had done exactly what their training dictated, but their training was designed for different scenarios. This required Ranger tactics, fast, aggressive, and focused on mission completion rather than risk mitigation. Her radio crackled. "All units, shots fired from Building 18, 2nd floor, east side. Civilian movement confirmed on the 3rd floor." Sarah grabbed the tactical bag from the passenger seat and began moving toward the building's rear entrance. She'd studied the family housing blueprints months ago as part of a routine fire safety assessment, another piece of information that had seemed merely administrative at the time but now proved crucial. The rear entrance was accessed through a small courtyard partially concealed by landscaping. Sarah approached from the north, using a maintenance shed as cover, and examined the door. Standard residential lock, no signs of forced entry, which meant the shooter had likely entered through the front and moved upstairs normally. She tested the door handle carefully. Unlocked. Either the shooter hadn't secured his retreat route, or this was a trap. Given the amateur nature of the perimeter breach, Sarah calculated 70% probability that tactical awareness was low. Her radio whispered, "Overwatch, this is command." A civilian called 911 from the 3rd floor, apartment 3B. A family of 4 barricaded themselves in the bathroom. The shooter attempted a door breach approximately 2 minutes ago. The timeline was accelerating. Sarah checked her watch, 3 minutes remaining before the MPs resumed their approach. If they moved while she was inside, they'd create crossfire situations with civilians in the middle. Sarah opened the rear door and stepped into the building's ground floor hallway. The familiar smell of military housing, industrial carpet, fresh paint, and the lingering aroma of 100 different family dinners. But underneath it, she detected something else, gunpowder residue and the sharp scent of fear. The building was eerily quiet except for muffled sounds from above. Sarah moved to the stairwell, her footsteps silent on the carpeted steps. Her ears filtered ambient noise automatically, sorting relevant audio from background interference, a skill that had kept her alive in Kandahar and dozens of other places where silence meant survival. Second floor landing. Sarah paused, listening. Heavy footsteps in the hallway, moving with purpose but without tactical discipline. The shooter was mobile, searching for targets rather than defending a position. Amateur tactics, which made him unpredictable but also vulnerable to professional countermeasures. Sarah keyed her radio, voice barely above a whisper. Overwatch to command. Suspect is mobile on second floor. I'm moving to the third floor to secure civilians before engagement. Negative, Overwatch. Too dangerous. Wait for backup. Sarah was already moving up the stairs. Command. Family in 3B doesn't have time for backup. The third floor hallway stretched 40 feet from the stairwell to the emergency exit. 6 apartment doors, 3 on each side. Apartment 3B was the second door on the right, and Sarah could hear quiet voices from inside, adults trying to keep children calm. She approached the door and tapped gently, using a pattern that wouldn't be confused with the shooter's previous attempts. 3 soft knocks. Pause, 2 more. Pause. 1 final tap. Who's there? The voice was female, tight with fear. Military police, Sarah whispered. I'm here to get you out safely. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman's terrified face. Oh, God, thank you. We heard shooting downstairs and… Ma'am, I need you to listen carefully. Take your family to the emergency exit at the end of the hall. Move quietly, stay low, and don't stop until you're outside the building. There are officers waiting to help you. What about the other families? Sarah could hear movement below them. The shooter was still active. I'll handle them. Go now. The family emerged from 3B, mother, father, 2 children, under 10. Sarah guided them to the hallway's far end, ensuring they understood the exit route, then moved to the next occupied apartment. 3A contained an elderly couple who'd been unaware of the crisis until Sarah explained. 3C was empty. The residents were deployed overseas. 3D housed a single mother with an infant, both hiding in a bedroom closet. As Sarah evacuated the third family group, her radio erupted with urgent chatter. Shots fired! First floor! The suspect is moving toward the lobby! The tactical situation had changed. The shooter was descending, which meant he was either retreating or hunting for easier targets. Sarah had seconds to decide. Continue evacuating civilians from the upper floors, or intercept the threat before he could escape or harm anyone else. She made the calculation with mathematical precision. 7 civilians successfully evacuated. An unknown number is still in the building. 1 active shooter with demonstrated willingness to target non-combatants. The equation was simple. Neutralize the threat. Sarah moved to the stairwell and began her descent, every sense alert for movement below. At the second floor landing, she paused, listening for position indicators. The gunfire had stopped, but she could hear rapid footsteps in the first floor hallway. Her radio crackled. Command to all units, suspect may be attempting to breach the front entrance. Perimeter teams, be advised. Sarah keyed her mic. Overwatch to command, negative. The suspect is still inside, on the first floor. Maintain a perimeter, do not approach the building. She reached the first floor and assessed the situation through sound analysis. The footsteps had stopped near what sounded like the main lobby area. Either the shooter was repositioning for another assault upstairs, or he was preparing for a confrontation with responding officers. Sarah moved through the ground floor hallway, using apartment doorways for concealment, closing distance to the lobby. Standard Ranger tactics. Surprise, speed, and overwhelming force applied at the point of contact. At the hallway's end, she could see into the lobby through a partially open fire door. The shooter stood 30 feet away, back to her position, wearing civilian clothes and carrying what appeared to be a semi-automatic rifle. He was looking out the front windows, watching the MP positions. Sarah had a clear shot, but taking it would mean firing toward the front entrance where friendly forces were positioned beyond the target. Unacceptable risk of collateral damage. She needed to change the tactical dynamic, force the shooter into a position where she could engage safely. Sarah picked up a piece of debris from the hallway floor, a broken piece of ceiling tile, and threw it toward the rear of the building. The sound made the shooter turn, bringing his weapon around toward the noise. As he moved, Sarah saw his profile clearly for the first time. Young male, early 20s, movements suggesting nervousness rather than training. The rifle was being held incorrectly, finger on the trigger instead of the guard. Amateur. Dangerous because of unpredictability, but vulnerable to professional tactics. Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "Drop your weapon and get on the ground, now." The shooter spun toward her voice, raising the rifle, but his movement was clumsy, untrained. Sarah was already moving, using the doorway for cover, closing distance while he struggled to acquire a target. "I said drop it!" Instead of compliance, the shooter fired wildly in her direction, bullets splintering the doorframe where Sarah had been standing a second earlier. Amateur mistake. He'd revealed his position while failing to verify his target. Sarah emerged from cover as the shooter attempted to cycle his weapons action, apparently unfamiliar with the rifle's operation. She covered the distance between them in 3 seconds, applying a textbook disarming technique that sent the weapon skittering across the lobby floor. The shooter went down hard, Sarah's knee in his back, her hand controlling his head position. "Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe hard." Her radio, overwatch to command, threat neutralized, building secure, send medical and detention teams. Within minutes, the lobby filled with MPs, medics, and officers. Sarah stood against the wall, watching them process the scene with professional efficiency. The shooter, who turned out to be a discharged soldier with mental health issues, was taken into custody without further incident. Colonel Hartford arrived as the last civilians were being evacuated from the upper floors. He found Sarah in the lobby, still wearing the tactical vest, her service weapon holstered, looking exactly like what she was, a professional soldier who just completed a successful mission. "Casualties?" he asked. "None. Shooter in custody, all civilians accounted for and safe." Hartford nodded, but his expression was complicated. "Mitchell, you realize what happens now?" Sarah understood. The administrative fiction was over. Too many people had witnessed her transformation from desk officer to tactical operator. Her personnel file would need to be updated, her assignment would change, and the comfortable anonymity she'd maintained for 18 months was gone forever. "Yes, sir." "Any regrets?" Sarah looked around the lobby where families had been terrorized, where an unstable individual had threatened innocent lives, where professional military training had been required to resolve a crisis that could have ended in tragedy. She thought about her spreadsheets, her logistics reports, her quiet corner desk where she'd spent over a year pretending to be someone she wasn't. "No, sir." No regrets. Word spread through Fort Braxton faster than wildfire in drought season. By 1,800 hours, every soldier on base had heard some version of the story. The quiet administrative lieutenant had single-handedly neutralized an active shooter, evacuated multiple families, and demonstrated tactical capabilities that defied her official personnel record. The officers who had mocked Sarah Mitchell over the past 18 months found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't deny what dozens of witnesses had seen, but accepting it meant acknowledging that they'd been completely wrong about someone for over a year. Major Kevin Walsh sat in the officers' club that evening, nursing his third bourbon and staring at the television coverage of the day's events. The news reports described a heroic intervention by military personnel, but didn't identify Sarah by name or detail her background. Lieutenant Brad Stevens joined him at the bar, his face pale and drawn. "Did you know?" Stevens asked quietly. Walsh shook his head. "Nobody knew. I've been going over her personnel file all afternoon. There's nothing there that suggests combat experience, special training, or operational background." "Then how?" "I don't know." Walsh's voice carried the weight of someone whose professional judgment had been fundamentally challenged. "I've been in intelligence for 12 years. I'm supposed to be good at reading people, identifying threats, and assessing capabilities. And I completely missed this. Captain Foster appeared beside them, looking haggard. As Sarah's direct supervisor, he'd spent the afternoon answering questions from senior officers who wanted to understand how a combat veteran with apparent special operations experience had been assigned to administrative duties without anyone knowing about it. "Any word from upstairs?" Stevens asked. Foster signaled the bartender for a drink. "Colonel Hartford is meeting with the base commander and someone from Pentagon personnel. Sarah's in debriefing with internal affairs and what I'm told are representatives from some very classified units." The three officers sat in uncomfortable silence, each processing the implications. If Sarah Mitchell had been hiding this level of capability, what else might they have missed? How many other assumptions about their fellow soldiers were equally wrong? Meanwhile, in Conference Room A of the headquarters building, Sarah sat across from a table of senior officers whose expressions ranged from curious to suspicious to openly impressed. Colonel Hartford was present, along with Brigadier General Patricia Williams, the base commander, and two men in civilian clothes who'd introduced themselves only as Mr. Johnson and Mr. Adams from Pentagon Personnel Review. "Let's start from the beginning," General Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers. "Your official personnel record shows no combat experience, no special operations training, and no advanced tactical qualifications. Yet today you demonstrated capabilities consistent with elite military units. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Sarah's posture was relaxed but attentive. "Ma'am, my personnel record accurately reflects my official assignments and training as recorded through normal channels." Mr. Johnson leaned forward. "That's not an answer, Lieutenant. We're asking about the disconnect between your official record and your demonstrated abilities." "My demonstrated abilities are the result of experiences that may not have been formally documented through standard personnel systems." The careful phrasing made General Williams narrow her eyes. "Are you telling us you've been involved in classified operations that weren't reflected in your service record?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with precision. "I'm telling you that some military operations require compartmentalized personnel records for operational security reasons." Mr. Adams consulted a thick folder. "We've been in contact with the 75th Ranger Regiment. They confirmed that a Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell was assigned to their unit from 2017 to 2019, with deployment records showing multiple combat operations in Afghanistan." "Then why," General Williams asked, "does your current record show you as a logistics officer with no combat experience?" Colonel Hartford spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Because someone made the decision to bury her real service record and create a cover identity for administrative assignment." The room fell silent. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Relief, perhaps, that the truth was finally being acknowledged. Mr. Johnson opened another folder. "Operation Steel Rain, Kandahar Province, March 2019. Joint Special Operations Mission targeting high-value terrorist assets. Intelligence failure led to coordinated ambush of American forces. 12 KIA, including an entire Special Operations team." He looked directly at Sarah. "Official after-action reports indicate that Staff Sergeant Mitchell's tactical decisions prevented additional casualties and enabled successful extraction of wounded personnel under heavy enemy fire." General Williams studied Sarah's face. "And after this operation?" "Psychological evaluation recommended temporary removal from combat duties." Mr. Adams continued reading. "The subject was exhibiting symptoms consistent with survivor's guilt and combat stress. The medical board recommended administrative assignment pending full psychological clearance." Sarah spoke quietly. "The recommendation was 18 months of non-combat duties, with periodic evaluation for return to operational status." "And now?" General Williams asked. "Now," Mr. Johnson said, closing the folder, "we have a situation where a decorated combat veteran with special operations experience has been masquerading as an administrative officer for 18 months, during which time she's had access to classified operational planning, personnel records, and base security protocols. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's administrative position had given her comprehensive knowledge of Fort Braxton's operations, capabilities, and vulnerabilities. If she'd been operating under false pretenses. Colonel Hartford's voice cut through the tension. "Are you suggesting that Lieutenant Mitchell represents a security risk?" "We're suggesting," Mr. Adams replied, that this situation raises questions that need to be addressed. Sarah's calm finally cracked, just slightly. Gentlemen, if I represented a security risk, do you think I would have spent 18 months filing logistics reports and coordinating training schedules? If my intentions were hostile, would I have revealed my capabilities to save civilian lives today? General Williams held up a hand, stopping the debate. The security implications aside, we need to address the immediate situation. As of today, Lieutenant Mitchell's true background is known to numerous personnel on this base. Her cover identity is no longer viable. She turned to Sarah directly, which means we need to decide what happens next. The question that had been building all afternoon was finally on the table. Sarah's administrative assignment was over. That much was clear. But what came next depended on decisions that would be made by people whose names she didn't know, in offices she'd never see. There are several options, Mr. Johnson said. Return to active duty with the Rangers, assignment to a special operations unit, transfer to another base where your background isn't known, or, he paused, early discharge with full benefits and a clean record. Sarah considered each option. Return to active combat operations meant facing the same psychological challenges that had led to her administrative assignment. Transfer meant starting over somewhere else, potentially facing the same issues. Discharge meant leaving the military entirely, abandoning the career that had defined her adult life. "What do you recommend?" she asked. General Williams exchanged glances with the civilian representatives. "Honestly, we're not sure. Your psychological evaluations 18 months ago recommended against immediate return to combat duties. But your performance today suggests those concerns may no longer be valid." Colonel Hartford spoke up. "If I may, General, Lieutenant Mitchell's behavior over the past 18 months has been exemplary. She's demonstrated exceptional competence, integrity, and dedication to duty. Today's events showed leadership and tactical excellence under pressure." "But," Williams prompted. "But she's also demonstrated a willingness to operate outside official channels when she believes mission requirements justify it. That's both an asset and a potential problem, depending on the situation." Sarah understood what Hartford was really saying. She'd spent 18 months following orders, maintaining her cover, and playing the role of administrative officer. But when lives were at stake, she'd abandoned that role without hesitation and taken action based on her own judgment rather than official protocols. It was exactly the kind of independent thinking that made special operations soldiers effective, and exactly the kind of behavior that made conventional military commanders nervous. "Lieutenant Mitchell," General Williams said, "what do you want?" The question was simple and impossible. What did she want? To go back to combat operations where people like her squad in Kandahar could die because of intelligence failures and command decisions beyond her control? To continue pushing papers and pretending to be someone she wasn't? To leave the military entirely and try to build a civilian life with skills that had no application outside of warfare? "I want to serve where I can make the most difference," Sarah said finally. "Whether that's in combat operations, training, support roles, or something else entirely." Mr. Adams made a note in his folder. "That's admirable, but it's not specific enough for personnel planning purposes." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the families she'd evacuated that afternoon, the terror in their eyes, the relief when they realized they were safe. She thought about her squad in Kandahar, the friends who died while she survived. She thought about 18 months of spreadsheets and logistics reports, and the careful fiction that she was just another administrative officer. "I want to train other soldiers," she said. "Combat tactics, crisis response, leadership under pressure. There are things I've learned that could save lives if they were taught properly." General Williams nodded slowly. "Instructor duty." "That's not what I expected you to say." "Ma'am, I've seen what happens when soldiers aren't properly prepared for combat situations. I've seen good people die because they didn't have the training or experience to handle unexpected circumstances." Sarah's voice carried conviction that hadn't been there during her administrative assignment. "I can't bring back my squad, but I can make sure other soldiers are better prepared than we were." The room was quiet as the officers considered her proposal. Training duty was respected but not glamorous. It would keep her in the military but away from active combat operations. It would allow her to use her experience constructively while avoiding the psychological stresses that had led to her administrative assignment. "We'll consider your request," General Williams said finally. "In the meantime, you're reassigned to special duties pending final disposition of your case." As the meeting ended and the participants filed out, Colonel Hartford walked alongside Sarah toward the parking lot. "You know this changes everything," he said. Sarah nodded. "I know." "No more quiet desk work. No more anonymity. People will be watching you differently now." "I know." Hartford stopped walking. "Any regrets about today?" Sarah looked back at the headquarters building, then toward the family housing area where lights were coming on in windows as families returned to their normal evening routines. "None," she said. "For the first time in 18 months, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The changes began immediately. By Friday morning, Sarah's desk in the administrative wing had been cleared out and reassigned. Her nameplate was gone. Her computer access had been transferred, and her 18 months of careful anonymity had vanished overnight. The space where she'd spent over a year pretending to be someone else now looked like she'd never existed at all. Lieutenant Brad Stevens stood in the empty cubicle, staring at the bare desktop where Sarah's perfectly organized workspace had been. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent months questioning her competence, her experience, her right to be in military briefings, only to discover that she was more qualified than most of the officers who'd been undermining her. Captain Foster appeared beside him, carrying a box of Sarah's personal items that had been left behind. "Anything in particular you're looking for, Stevens?" Stevens shook his head. "Just trying to figure out how I got it so wrong." Foster set the box down and studied the empty space. "You weren't the only one. I supervised her for 18 months and never suspected anything beyond what her personnel file indicated. But there were signs," Stevens said. "The way she analyzed logistics problems, her knowledge of military protocols, the way she carried herself. How did we miss all of that?" "Because we saw what we expected to see," Foster replied. "Administrative officer, desk duty, someone who'd never been in combat. Once we formed that impression, everything else got filtered through it." Stevens picked up a small American flag from the box, the same flag that had sat beside Sarah's keyboard for over a year. "She must have thought we were idiots, watching us make assumptions about her while she knew exactly what she was capable of." "I don't think she thought we were idiots," Foster said quietly. "I think she was grateful that we didn't ask too many questions." Meanwhile, across the base at the Officer Development Center, Sarah was meeting with Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, the senior instructor for advanced tactical training. Rodriguez had 23 years of service, including multiple deployments with airborne and special operations units. His reputation for producing competent combat leaders was legendary throughout the Army. "So they want you to develop a new curriculum," Rodriguez said, reviewing the orders that had come down from base command. "Crisis response for officers, tactical decision-making under pressure, leadership in unconventional situations." Sarah nodded. "Based on real-world scenarios rather than textbook examples." Rodriguez studied her carefully. "You know, I've been training officers for 8 years. Most of them come to me with plenty of theoretical knowledge and very little practical experience. They know what the manuals say, but they've never had to make split-second decisions when lives are on the line. That's the problem I want to address." "And you think you can fix that because of what happened yesterday?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I think I can fix that because of what happened in Kandahar, and because of what I learned during 18 months of watching officers make assumptions based on incomplete information." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, processing her answer. "Tell me about Kandahar." For the first time since the debriefing, Sarah spoke about Operation Steel Rain in detail. Not the sanitized version from official reports, but the reality of what had happened when 12 soldiers walked into an ambush, because intelligence analysis had failed to account for local political dynamics that any experienced operator should have recognized. "My squad leader was a good man," Sarah said. 10 years of experience, multiple deployments, excellent training record, but he'd never operated in an environment where the local population was actively hostile to American presence while simultaneously dependent on our protection." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The intelligence briefing told us we were entering a friendly village to conduct a joint patrol with Afghan forces. What we actually encountered was a coordinated ambush by insurgents who'd been using that village as a staging area for weeks." Rodriguez leaned forward. "What went wrong with intelligence?" The analysts assumed that because the village had cooperated with previous American operations, they would continue to cooperate. They didn't account for the fact that cooperation had been coerced, not voluntary. They didn't understand that the village leaders were feeding information to insurgents while appearing to support coalition forces. And your squad walked into a trap. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Rodriguez could see the weight she carried. We walked into a trap that should have been obvious to anyone who understood the human dynamics of counterinsurgency operations. But the intelligence analysts were looking at data points instead of behavioral patterns. Rodriguez understood. So when you were assigned to administrative duties, you had 18 months to watch officers make similar mistakes on a smaller scale. Every day, Sarah confirmed. Officers making decisions based on what they thought they knew instead of what the evidence actually showed. Assumptions about personnel, about logistics, about operational requirements that weren't supported by careful analysis. Like assumptions about you. Like assumptions about me. Rodriguez stood and walked to a wall map showing various training areas around Fort Braxton. If you're going to train officers to make better decisions under pressure, you'll need to create scenarios that challenge their assumptions and force them to adapt when their initial analysis proves wrong. Sarah joined him at the map. That's exactly what I have in mind. 2 days later, the first reckoning came for those who had underestimated Sarah Mitchell. Major Kevin Walsh received orders transferring him to a staff position at Fort Leavenworth, officially a lateral move, but one that removed him from intelligence work and placed him in a role focused on administrative oversight of training programs. The transfer wasn't officially connected to his treatment of Sarah, but Walsh knew better. Military justice often worked through administrative actions rather than formal disciplinary proceedings. His inability to recognize the capabilities of a decorated combat veteran reflected poorly on his judgment as an intelligence officer. Lieutenant Stevens faced a different kind of consequence. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Janet Pierce, called him into her office for what was described as a, quote, developmental counseling session. Stevens, we need to discuss your performance over the past several months, Pierce began, her tone professional but cold. Stevens had been dreading this conversation since news of Sarah's background had become general knowledge. Ma'am, if this is about Lieutenant Mitchell, this is about your judgment, your leadership, and your ability to assess the capabilities of fellow officers, Pierce interrupted. You spent months undermining a decorated combat veteran based on incomplete information and personal assumptions. Ma'am, her personnel file didn't indicate. Her personnel file is irrelevant to this discussion. You made professional assessments of a fellow officer based on superficial observations rather than demonstrated competence. That's a failure of leadership judgment. Stevens stared at his hands. Yes, ma'am. More importantly, your behavior created a hostile work environment for someone who was dealing with combat trauma while serving in a role she didn't choose. Your actions potentially interfered with her recovery and reintegration process. The weight of Pierce's words hit Stevens harder than any formal reprimand could have. He'd thought he was challenging someone he perceived as unqualified, but he'd actually been harassing a veteran struggling with the psychological aftermath of losing her entire squad. Stevens, you're being reassigned to the Professional Development Center for 6 months of intensive leadership training. You'll study case studies in officer evaluation, personnel management, and ethical leadership. When you complete the program, we'll reassess your readiness for command responsibilities. It wasn't a career-ending punishment, but it was a clear message that his behavior had consequences beyond his own reputation. Captain Foster received a different kind of reckoning, one that came from within rather than from official channels. As Sarah's direct supervisor, he'd had more opportunity than anyone to recognize her true capabilities, and his failure to do so reflected poorly on his management skills. The realization hit him during a conversation with Sergeant First Class Diana Rodriguez, who'd stopped by his office to discuss Sarah's reassignment. You know, sir, I tried to tell people there was more to Lieutenant Mitchell than what appeared in her file, Rodriguez said. Foster looked up from his paperwork. What do you mean? The way she analyzed problems, the depth of her knowledge about military operations, the way she carried herself. It was obvious she had experience beyond what was officially documented. Obvious to you, maybe. Rodriguez shook her head. Obvious to anyone who was paying attention. The problem was that most people had already decided what they thought about her, so they stopped looking for evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Foster was quiet for a moment, processing the implication. Are you saying I failed as a supervisor? I'm saying that managing people effectively requires understanding who they really are, not just who their paperwork says they are. Lieutenant Mitchell spent 18 months being underutilized because nobody took the time to really assess her capabilities. The conversation forced Foster to confront an uncomfortable truth. He'd been a competent administrator, but a poor leader. He'd managed Sarah's work assignments efficiently, but had failed to understand her as a person or recognize her potential contributions beyond routine administrative tasks. Later that week, Foster requested a transfer to a position with less personnel management responsibility. He wasn't being punished, exactly, but he recognized that his skills were better suited to technical work than leadership roles. Meanwhile, Sarah began developing her new training curriculum with the intensity she'd once applied to combat operations. The program she designed was unlike anything currently offered in military professional development courses. Instead of theoretical scenarios based on historical examples, Sarah created training exercises based on real-world situations where officer assumptions had led to mission failures, casualties, or missed opportunities. Students would be given incomplete information, contradictory reports, and time pressure that forced them to make decisions without perfect knowledge. The goal, she explained to Master Sergeant Rodriguez, is to teach officers to question their initial assumptions, gather additional information before committing to a course of action, and remain flexible when situations don't develop as expected. Rodriguez reviewed her preliminary curriculum outline. This is significantly more challenging than standard officer development programs. Good. Combat is significantly more challenging than standard training exercises. The first pilot class was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, with students drawn from various units across Fort Braxton. Word had already spread that the new instructor was the same lieutenant who'd been working in administrative duties for over a year, the one who'd turned out to be a decorated special operations veteran. Some officers were curious about learning from someone with her background. Others were skeptical about training developed by someone they'd previously dismissed as a desk jockey. But none of them could ignore the fact that Sarah Mitchell had demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about assessing military personnel. As Sarah prepared for her new role, she reflected on the 18 months she'd spent hiding her true identity. The isolation had been difficult, but it had also provided her with insights about leadership, judgment, and human nature that would inform her teaching for years to come. She'd learned that competence could be invisible if people weren't looking for it. She'd seen how assumptions could blind even experienced officers to evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. And she'd observed how organizational culture could prevent talented people from contributing to their full potential. Those lessons would become the foundation of her training philosophy: question assumptions, look beyond surface appearances, and create environments where people's true capabilities could emerge. The quiet administrative officer who'd hidden behind spreadsheets and logistics reports was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood both the cost of being underestimated and the responsibility that came with recognition. Sarah Mitchell was ready to teach other officers what she'd learned, not just about tactical operations, but about the far more complex challenge of understanding the people they served alongside. 6 months after the crisis that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell stood before her first advanced leadership class in the newly constructed Crisis Response Training Center at Fort Braxton. The facility had been built specifically for her program, featuring modular rooms that could simulate everything from urban combat environments to emergency command centers. 24 officers sat in the briefing room, representing various branches and experience levels. Some were recently promoted lieutenants, seeking to enhance their leadership skills. Others were seasoned captains and majors who'd been recommended for the program by their commanding officers. All of them knew Sarah's story, but none of them were quite sure what to expect. "Welcome to Advanced Leadership Under Pressure," Sarah began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. "Over the next 2 weeks, you'll participate in scenarios designed to test your judgment, challenge your assumptions, and force you to make critical decisions with incomplete information." Captain James Murray, a logistics officer from the 82nd Airborne, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do these scenarios differ from standard command and staff exercises?" Sarah smiled, the expression carrying just a hint of anticipation. "Captain Murray, in standard exercises, you're typically given a defined problem with known parameters and expected to apply established procedures to reach a solution. In my scenario, the problem changes while you're trying to solve it. The information you receive may be deliberately misleading, and the procedures you've memorized may be completely inadequate. She gestured to a large screen that displayed what appeared to be a routine logistics coordination exercise. For example, your first scenario involves coordinating transportation for a humanitarian aid mission. Simple enough, you've all managed logistics operations before. The officers nodded, looking confident. Logistics coordination was basic staff work. However, Sarah continued, what you don't know is that the transportation routes have been compromised by hostile forces, the local government contact is actually an intelligence asset for an opposing faction, and the humanitarian supplies you're delivering contain equipment that could be used for military purposes. The confidence in the room faded, as the officers realized they weren't looking at a simple logistics exercise, but a complex strategic scenario with political, military, and ethical implications. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Stone, the same officer who'd confronted Sarah in the hallway 18 months earlier, was now participating in the course as part of her professional development requirements. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Stone herself. "Ma'am," Stone said, "how do we prepare for scenarios where the basic assumptions of our mission may be incorrect?" Sarah's response carried the weight of hard-earned experience. You prepare by learning to recognize when your assumptions aren't supported by observable evidence, and by developing the intellectual flexibility to adapt when your initial analysis proves wrong. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of mountains in Afghanistan. In March 2019, I was part of a joint operation based on intelligence that assured us we were entering a friendly village to conduct a routine patrol. That assumption led to 12 American deaths because nobody questioned whether the intelligence reflected current reality rather than historical patterns. The room was completely silent. This wasn't theoretical instruction, it was lessons written in blood. The purpose of this training isn't to make you paranoid or indecisive, Sarah continued. It's to teach you to distinguish between confidence based on solid evidence and confidence based on wishful thinking. Over the following 2 weeks, Sarah's students were subjected to a series of increasingly complex scenarios that challenged every aspect of their leadership training. They were forced to command units with conflicting loyalties, manage resources that didn't exist, and make strategic decisions based on information that was deliberately incomplete or contradictory. The first major breakthrough came during a scenario involving a hostage rescue operation. Major Derek Thompson, an infantry officer with 2 combat deployments, had been assigned to plan and execute the mission based on intelligence reports and reconnaissance data. Thompson spent hours developing a detailed assault plan, accounting for enemy positions, civilian locations, and extraction routes. When he presented his plan to Sarah for approval, she asked a single question. "Major, what makes you confident that the hostages are actually in the building your intelligence indicates?" Thompson stared at her, realizing he'd accepted the intelligence without questioning its accuracy or recency. The reconnaissance reports showed. The reconnaissance reports showed activity in that building 3 days ago. Do you have any current confirmation that the hostages are still there, or that the enemy hasn't moved them as a precautionary measure? The question forced Thompson to completely reconsider his approach. Instead of planning an assault based on potentially outdated intelligence, he had to develop verification methods, alternative scenarios, and contingency plans for multiple possibilities. This is how mistakes happen in real operations, Sarah explained after the exercise. Intelligence gives you their best assessment, but intelligence is always historical. The enemy doesn't stop moving and adapting just because you've received a briefing. Lieutenant Colonel Stone found herself struggling more than most students, not because she lacked competence, but because her previous management style had relied heavily on established procedures and clear hierarchical authority. Sarah's scenarios deliberately created situations where standard procedures were inadequate, and hierarchical authority was unclear or compromised. During a complex multi-agency coordination exercise, Stone made several critical errors by trying to impose military command structures on civilian organizations that operated under completely different principles. Her frustration was evident, as her carefully planned coordination efforts fell apart due to cultural and procedural conflicts she hadn't anticipated. Sarah pulled Stone aside after the exercise for a private discussion. "Rebecca, what do you think went wrong?" Stone's jaw was tight with controlled frustration. The civilian agencies weren't following proper coordination protocols. They kept changing their requirements and questioning my decisions instead of executing orders. And why do you think they were doing that? Because they don't understand military efficiency and chain of command. Sarah was quiet for a moment, letting Stone process her own words. Or because they operate in environments where collaboration and consensus building are more effective than top-down command structures, and they are trying to share information that might improve your decision-making. The insight hit Stone like a physical impact. She'd been so focused on maintaining command authority that she'd missed opportunities to gather valuable input from people with specialized knowledge and local expertise. I treated them like subordinates instead of partners, Stone said quietly. And in doing so, you missed crucial information that could have made your mission more successful. Sarah's voice carried no judgment, just observation. Leadership isn't always about giving orders. Sometimes, it's about creating conditions where the right information can surface and the best decisions can emerge. It was the same lesson Sarah had learned during 18 months of administrative duty, watching officers make assumptions about her capabilities while missing opportunities to utilize her experience effectively. The transformation in Sarah's students was remarkable. Officers who'd arrived confident in their established methods left with a more nuanced understanding of leadership complexity. They'd learned to question their assumptions, seek additional information, and adapt to changing circumstances without losing operational effectiveness. More importantly, they'd developed what Sarah called intellectual humility, the recognition that competence could exist in unexpected places, and that effective leadership required constant learning rather than just the application of established knowledge. As the first class graduated, Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with an observation that had been building throughout the training period. "Ma'am, these officers are different now, not just more skilled, but more aware." Sarah nodded. "They've learned to see what's actually there instead of what they expect to see. Like people should have done with you." Exactly like people should have done with me. The success of Sarah's program led to requests from other military installations for similar training. Within a year, her curriculum was being adapted for use at command and staff colleges across the military. The lessons she'd learned through personal experience, about assumptions, judgment, and the cost of underestimating people, became foundational elements in professional military education. But the most significant impact wasn't in the formal training programs. It was in the cultural shift that began at Fort Braxton and spread throughout the units where Sarah's students served. Officers who'd learned to question their assumptions about tactical situations began applying the same critical thinking to their assessments of personnel. Sarah often encountered former students who would describe changes in their leadership approach, taking time to really understand their soldiers' capabilities, looking beyond surface appearances when making personnel decisions, and creating environments where people could contribute their full potential regardless of their official job descriptions. 2 years after the crisis that had ended her administrative cover, Sarah received a visit from Colonel Hartford, who'd been promoted to Brigadier General and was departing Fort Braxton for a new assignment. "I wanted to thank you before I left," Hartford said as they walked through the training center that had become Sarah's domain. "For what, sir?" "For showing us what we were missing. Not just about you, specifically, but about how many talented people we probably overlook because we make quick judgments based on incomplete information." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "Sir, the administrative assignment served its purpose. I needed time to process what happened in Kandahar, and the Army needed to be sure I was psychologically ready to return to operational duties." "But 18 months of hiding your capabilities?" 18 months of learning about leadership from a different perspective, Sarah corrected. "I learned more about effective command during that time than I did in years of combat operations." Hartford understood. "Because you were observing how decisions were made when you had no authority to influence them. And because I was experiencing what it feels like to be underestimated, dismissed, and excluded from discussions where my experience could have been valuable." Sarah's voice carried conviction. "Every officer should understand what that feels like, because it's what happens to their soldiers every day." As Hartford prepared to leave, he asked one final question. Any regrets about how things turned out? Sarah looked around the training center, thinking about the hundreds of officers who'd passed through her programs, the cultural changes that were slowly spreading throughout the military, and the ongoing mission of teaching leaders to see beyond their assumptions. "No regrets," she said. "Everything that happened, the 18 months of administrative duty, the crisis that ended it, the consequences for people who misjudged me, All of it was necessary for me to understand what I needed to teach. She paused, considering her words carefully. I couldn't have developed this training program based on combat experience alone. I needed to understand what it felt like to be invisible, to have my capabilities dismissed, to watch people make poor decisions because they weren't using all available resources, including the resources of your experience, including the resources of my experience. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of leadership training in the early 21st century, they would identify Sarah Mitchell's program as a turning point in how the armed forces approached professional development. Her methods became standard curriculum, her insights were quoted in leadership manuals, and her emphasis on intellectual humility became foundational to military education. But Sarah herself remained focused on the immediate mission, teaching one class at a time, challenging one assumption at a time, and helping leaders understand that the most dangerous oversight isn't failing to see the enemy, it's failing to see the capabilities of the people on your own side. The quiet administrative officer who'd once hidden behind spreadsheets and logistics reports had found her true calling. Not in combat operations, where success was measured in missions completed and enemies defeated, but in the more complex challenge of changing how leaders think, assess, and decide. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what the military needed her to do, and this time everyone could see it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.